There comes a moment when silence speaks louder than any scream, louder than any defense, louder than any carefully crafted sentence you could have thrown back at them. It doesn't need punctuation. It doesn't ask for a round of applause. It just stands there, still, unwavering, undeniable, because silence is clarity without conflict. It's power without aggression. It's truth without noise. When someone disrespects you, betrays you, underestimates you, your greatest weapon isn't your voice, it's your refusal to engage. You don't owe them a reaction. You don't owe them a breakdown. You owe yourself peace. You owe yourself preservation. Because every time you explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you lose a piece of your energy, and they gain a sense of control. That's why silence terrifies people. It doesn't give them something to manipulate. It doesn't give them something to twist. It just leaves them alone with their own behavior. And most people aren't ready for that mirror. They expect you to fight, to yell, to plead, to react, because as long as you react, they're still relevant. But the moment you go silent, the moment you withdraw your emotional energy, the entire game changes. Silence ends arguments that ego would have dragged out for days. Silence exposes character more than confrontation ever could. And silence, more than anything, is your declaration that you no longer need to prove your worth, because you finally remembered it. See, the world tells you that power is loud, that if you want to be respected, you must dominate, control, bark back. But real power moves in quiet decisions. Real power is in the moment you choose to walk away instead of trying to fix what's already broken. Real power is in the restraint, not the reaction. And silence is not weakness, it's wisdom. The kind of wisdom that says, I don't need to win this argument. I've already outgrown it. Because silence doesn't beg. Silence doesn't chase. Silence doesn't perform for approval. Silence says, I saw everything. I felt everything. I processed everything. And now I choose nothing. Nothing to prove. Nothing to fight for. Nothing to hold on to. And that is terrifying to those who feed on drama. To those who only feel alive when they can pull you into chaos. But you've learned. You've learned that not every insult deserves an answer, that not every betrayal requires closure, that not every situation needs your energy. Some things don't need fixing, they need space. Some people don't need a response, they need to watch you leave. Because silence protects what explanation would destroy. It keeps your dignity intact, it holds your boundaries firm, and it allows the truth to echo in a way that words never could. They'll remember your silence. Long after the noise fades, long after the texts are left on read, long after the conversation they rehearsed in their head never happens, they'll remember that you didn't give them what they wanted, your energy, your fire, your validation. You gave them something more piercing, your absence. And there's no comeback for that. There's no defense against someone who stops playing the game, who doesn't need to win because they no longer care to compete, who doesn't retaliate because they've already released the need to be understood by someone who never truly saw them. That's the kind of silence that shakes people, not because it's cruel, but because it's clear. And clarity is the loudest sound of all. You don't need a final word. You don't need a grand exit speech. You need one solid decision. I'm done explaining myself to those who refuse to listen. I'm done reacting to energy that drains me. I'm done proving what has always been self-evident, because the truth doesn't need defending. And when your presence is powerful, your silence becomes sacred. So let them wonder. Let them overthink. Let them sit in the silence you left behind. Because in that silence, they'll hear the echo of everything they ignored, the respect they took for granted, the patience they abused, the energy they didn't appreciate until it was gone. That's your answer. Not in what you say, but in what you no longer feel the need to say. People fear silence not because it's empty, but because it's full. full of reflection, full of accountability, full of the truths they tried to outrun. When you stop responding, you create a space they can't fill with excuses. When you stop reacting, they're forced to face themselves, and that is terrifying for anyone who built their sense of control through your emotional availability, because your reactions gave them power, your explanations gave them comfort, your presence gave them the illusion that nothing was wrong, even when everything was. But the day you fall silent is the day their comfort ends. Suddenly, there's no validation, no reply, no spark to feed their ego, just stillness. And stillness is confronting. Stillness forces people to sit with what they've done, without distraction, without deflection. That's why silence is not just a response. It's a boundary, a message that says, I will not be baited. I will not be pulled into another performance. I will not water a connection that drains me. You see, people who mistreat you often depend on your reactions to justify their behavior. If you yell, now you're crazy. If you cry, now you're too emotional. If you fight, now you're the problem. But silence? Silence gives them nothing. Silence forces them to confront what they were hoping to manipulate. It exposes their actions without your help. And the louder their guilt, the more uncomfortable your quiet becomes. That's when you realize your energy was the glue, your effort was the bridge, your presence was the peace. And now that you've withdrawn it, everything feels unstable, not because you said anything, but because you finally said nothing, and nothing is powerful. Nothing creates room for truth to breathe. Nothing removes the fog of confusion. It's in that space of no reply, no defense, no chase, where the truth finally becomes visible. You see who reaches. You see who disappears. You see who only stayed because you kept showing up first. That's the silent filter. That's the beauty of restraint. It doesn't just protect your peace, it reveals theirs, or the lack of it. And maybe they never expected you to stop responding. Maybe they were so used to your energy, they mistook it for obligation. But silence teaches them that your love was never guaranteed, that your patience had limits, that your presence was not something they could keep disrespecting and still expect to have. And sometimes that lesson hits hardest not in your words, but in your withdrawal. In the space where you used to pour love, now there is only air. In the place where your energy once held everything together, now there is distance. And in that distance, they hear every moment they ignored you, every time they spoke over your needs, every chance they had to love you better, but chose not to. That's the weight of silence. It speaks in echoes, and the longer it stretches, the more undeniable the truth becomes. You were never the problem. You were the mirror. You were the presence that reflected their gaps. And once you stopped, they saw them, not because you told them, but because your absence made them visible. Silence is not about punishing others, it's about protecting yourself. It's about stepping out of the emotional ring and saying, I refuse to fight battles that should have never existed. It's about choosing inner stability over outer chaos. And yes, it's hard. It's hard not to defend yourself. It's hard not to explain your side. It's hard not to chase clarity. But peace doesn't beg. It doesn't argue. It doesn't chase closure, because it becomes closure. When you become peaceful, you realize that not everything deserves your voice, that not everyone is owed a response, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing, because silence is not emptiness. It's full of everything they didn't want to face, and now they must alone. Silence is the space where you return to yourself. It's the sacred pause where you stop dancing to other people's chaos and finally ask, what do I need? Not what do they want, not what do they expect, not what will make them stay, but what actually honors my peace. Because for so long, you spoke when you should have stayed quiet. You chased when you should have paused. You tried to fix what was never yours to carry. And each time, you lost a piece of your center. Until one day, you stopped. You stopped answering texts that drained you. You stopped responding to arguments designed only to pull you back into dysfunction. You stop performing the role of the strong one, just to keep the connection alive. And in that stillness, in that powerful decision not to explain yourself, something changed. You felt calm. You felt light. You felt something you hadn't felt in a long time, free, because silence isn't just an action. It's a shift, a recentering, a reclaiming of power. You are no longer moved by their moods, no longer thrown off by their absence or silence. You meet it with your own, not to hurt, not to manipulate, but to say, you don't get to pull me into chaos anymore. I choose alignment over attention. I choose boundaries over validation. And that choice, it changes everything. You start realizing how much of your past energy was spent over-explaining to people who never cared to understand. How much of your peace was sacrificed trying to defend your feelings to someone committed to gaslighting them. How much of your time was given to people who only noticed your value when you pulled it away. But now you are different. Now you let silence answer where words once pleaded. Now you let distance speak where effort was once abused. Now you trust that the people meant to understand you won't need a script to hear you. They'll feel your absence, and they'll feel what your presence used to provide. Because that's the truth. Your presence has value. Your calm is a gift. Your energy is sacred. And the moment you stop giving it to those who only take, you begin to feel whole again. You begin to see yourself not as someone desperate to be heard, but as someone wise enough to know when to stop speaking. Silence teaches you self-respect. It teaches you that peace is not found in being right, but in being free. Free from the need to explain, to convince, to manage other people's reactions. You stop fearing what they'll think. You stop fearing being misunderstood, because being misunderstood is far less painful than constantly abandoning yourself to be accepted. Let them think you're cold. Let them think you're distant. Let them wonder why you went quiet. You don't owe anyone access to your process. Healing isn't always loud. Growth isn't always visible. And strength isn't always in your words. Sometimes it's in your silence, in your choice to observe instead of argue, to breathe instead of react, to walk away instead of retaliate. And the more you practice it, the more you realize. Silence doesn't mean you've lost the fight. It means you've ended the war within yourself. You've chosen peace over pride, groundedness over chaos. You've chosen you. And that is the loudest answer of all, because people may not understand your silence, but they'll feel it deeply, in every unanswered message, in every call you don't return, in every argument you don't engage. They'll feel it, and they'll know. You are no longer available for disrespect. You are no longer accessible to manipulation. You are no longer someone who explains themselves just to keep someone else comfortable. You are silent now, not because you have nothing to say, but because what you have to say no longer needs to be spoken. It has already been lived, and that is power. There's something magnetic about a person who doesn't need to raise their voice to be heard. Something unforgettable about someone who doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't try to prove, and yet commands respect without ever asking for it. That's the power of silence when it's owned, when it's no longer a reaction, but a presence that says, I know who I am, I know what I bring, and I don't need to make noise to remind you. That kind of silence isn't awkward, it's potent. It draws people in, not because it seeks attention, but because it doesn't. And in a world addicted to over-explaining, over-posting, and over-sharing, the one who doesn't speak becomes the one everyone listens for. Because silence builds mystique, it invites curiosity, it commands space in a room without fighting for it. Why? Because we feel energy more than we hear words. And silence, when aligned with inner strength, becomes a form of gravity. You walk into a room and people sense it. You don't need to declare your worth. Your peace speaks for you. Your restraint radiates, your boundaries vibrate, and without saying a thing, you set the tone. That's what happens when your silence is rooted in self-respect, not passive aggression, not withdrawal for attention, but real, grounded clarity. People can feel the difference, because silence from insecurity feels cold, but silence from confidence feels unshakable. And the truth is, the more silent you become, the more others start speaking for you. They fill in the blanks with their own projections. They wonder why you stopped talking, why you stopped responding, why you no longer play the game. They try to guess, they overthink, and in doing so, they reveal everything you no longer needed to ask. Silence shows you who respects your space, who can sit with your quiet without trying to control it, who reaches back when you no longer chase, who listens even when you don't speak, because the people meant for you don't need constant explanation. They feel your energy and respect it. And those who can't handle your silence, they were never in tune with your truth. They were addicted to the noise, not connected to the soul. So let them go. Let the silence sort what your voice used to struggle with. Let it speak on your behalf. Because sometimes silence is the boundary you didn't know how to set before. It's the pause between chapters, the breath before rebirth, the end of one version of you and the quiet unveiling of another, stronger, calmer, clearer, no longer ruled by the need to be understood, no longer tied to roles that drained your spirit. Now, your silence isn't avoidance. It's discernment. It's choosing when to speak and when to listen, when to respond and when to retreat. It's emotional maturity in its purest form. You're no longer reactive. You're intentional. No longer desperate. You're discerning. No longer loud, because your life has become the volume. Your presence has become the punctuation. Your stillness has become the proof. And those who are meant to hear you will, not through noise, but through alignment, through vibration, through the quiet power of someone who doesn't need to say a word to be understood. So when you're silent now, it's not because you've given up. It's because you've stepped up. You've learned to speak only when it adds value, to conserve your words like sacred currency, and to protect your energy like the royalty you've become, because silence isn't the absence of strength. It's the evolution of it. It's the calm after the chaos, the wisdom after the war. And it's in that silence that your life begins to speak for you, loudly, clearly, without compromise. There comes a moment when silence is no longer a tactic. It's a truth, a statement louder than any speech, clearer than any justification, deeper than any apology that never came. Because you've reached a place where you no longer need the last word. The conversation ends not with a sentence, but with your stillness. And in that stillness, there is no confusion, no ambiguity, no lingering doubt, only clarity, the kind that doesn't come from talking, but from choosing to no longer participate. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing. You've said enough, you've done enough, you've tried enough, and now your silence is your closure. It's not about winning. It's about walking away from things that never deserved your presence in the first place. You finally see it. You finally believe it. Not everything deserves access to your voice. Not everyone is qualified to hear your heart. And the moment you stop explaining your soul to people who only listen to their ego, you rise, you ascend, not because you're above them, but because you're beyond the need to prove yourself. Your silence becomes your separation. Your distance becomes your healing, and your absence becomes the echo that reminds them you were never theirs to mistreat. You were a gift, and now you're gone. Not because you disappeared, but because you returned to yourself, to the version of you that doesn't need approval, that doesn't bend to keep peace, that doesn't water itself down to fit in places that were never meant for your roots to grow. That's what silence gives you. Not just freedom from others, but freedom from your own patterns, from the impulse to over-explain, from the urge to seek validation, from the habit of shrinking your truth to protect someone else's comfort. Silence breaks the cycle, And in that quiet, something beautiful happens. You start to hear yourself again. You start to trust yourself again. You start to rebuild from within, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily. Because real healing isn't noisy, it's sacred. And real transformation doesn't need to announce itself. It becomes undeniable. People begin to notice. They ask if you're okay. They wonder why you've changed. But the truth is, you didn't change. You returned. To the calm you were always meant to embody. To the self-respect you were always worthy of. To the grounded power you had buried under years of trying to be heard. And now you are no longer begging for space. You are becoming the space. No longer seeking peace. You are the peace. That's the full circle of silence. It begins in pain, but it ends in power. It begins as a shield, but becomes your sword. And eventually, you don't just use silence, you become it. A walking presence that speaks without noise, that leaves impact without effort, that commands respect, not with force, but with quiet certainty. So let them wonder, let them reach out, let them scroll through old messages, trying to find the version of you who would have explained, chased, replied. That version no longer exists. The new you doesn't respond out of pressure. You respond from alignment. You speak only when it's rooted in truth, and when it's not, you let silence answer for you, because now you finally understand. Not every storm requires your thunder. Not every injustice deserves your fire, and not every loss is a tragedy. Sometimes it's a doorway, and your silence, that's the key that locks the past and opens the door to your next chapter. Not louder, but stronger. Not angrier, but freer. Not reactive, but radiant. This is the beauty of silence, when you wear it not as armor, but as identity, when it stops being what you fall into and becomes what you rise from. So speak when it matters, but when it doesn't, stay silent, not because you're powerless, but because your power has evolved beyond the need to prove it.